Despite Jungle being a very small set, it actually changed a lot for the meta in the Pokemon TCG at the time. As we saw last time, the Haymaker was through and through the best deck in the format, and pretty much every other deck had to follow suit and have an answer to Haymaker, otherwise they weren't going to find themselves high on the ranking. But in Jungle, that's not necessarily the case. There's a lot of tech that comes out and a lot of new decks that are available that have their own way of coming to the forefront of the meta. So we're going to be talking about that today, and we're going to be breaking down all of the decks and where they place in this Jungle tier list. Starting from the bottom here, we're going to talk about Boyfriends, which is a hilarious deck concept that focuses around Nidoking and Nidoqueen. Nidoking was from base set and never really had a good chance to shine, but it does have some decent attacks. It can do toxic and make it so your opponent becomes poisoned, and they take an extra damage in between each checkup. And then you have Nidoqueen, which for 2 energy does 20 damage plus 20 more damage for every Nidoking on your bench, which is pretty good. If you can get 3 or 4 Nidoking set up, you're doing 80, 100 damage even. The problem is they're both stage 2 Pokemon, which means they're very difficult to set up, especially in a format that doesn't have a lot of searching options. Realistically, you only have computer search and Pokemon Trader. So imagine playing a deck where your only searching options are Ultra Ball and Pokemon Communications. It's not the end of the world for decks that aren't evolution strategies, or maybe stage 1 at best. For stage 2s, when you're playing 2 stage 2 lines, it's very difficult to get set up, which is why there was a few decks that I omitted in the last tier list that I did, in the base set tier list, which you can see here. But Boyfriends, unfortunately, despite it being a very fun deck and a deck that was very inherently designed to be played as it's not very often in the WotC era we get cards that so obviously present themselves as a strategy, and Nidoqueen certainly does that, but unfortunately it's not enough, and whereas it is fun, it's going to find itself in the non-competitive tier. Now, on the other hand, we have Haymaker, the traditional Haymaker. It does get a few new support cards here, so on top of it getting Scyther, which is the replacement for Doduo or Farfetch'd, we now also have Dodrio, which can help with the 2 retreat cost of all the Haymaker cards. This particular version is the pure build, so this is Hitmonchan, Electabuzz, Scyther. You're playing either a 3-3 line of each, or a 4-4-3, or some variation of that. Once again, it is still one of, if not the best deck in the format, but it isn't going to be defined as the best deck in format. It's going to find itself in the tier 1, and we'll sort of explain that along the way as to why it fell down a peg and why this isn't a BDIF format. Charizard Haymaker is also in a weird spot, as there's another deck that kind of does what Charizard Haymaker does better, as it doesn't require the full setup, but it pretty much does the same thing. Charizard does kind of get a little bit better because of the fact that almost every deck in the format is running Scyther, which is the new best free retreater, and it hits it for weakness, so you're playing the Hitmonchan or the Electabuzz, both, whatever, and the Charizard, but the biggest issue is base and jungle is typically faster. You're going to see a lot more Pokemon capable of getting those turn 1, turn 2 knockouts than you would have in just pure base set, where really Haymaker was the only deck you had to worry about as far as getting those turn 1 knockouts. So having low HP Pokemon is more of a reliability than ever, and this definitely shows it. But it is going to find itself in the new tier, which is the anti-meta tier, which I'll explain just a little bit here. The anti-meta tier is pretty much self-explanatory. I talked about the tiers last time, how they all line up and what they mean, but anti-meta is a new inclusion for this base and jungle tier list because there's a lot more decks that actually fit this niche of being very specific decks that target exactly what the meta is doing and have an answer to it, but aren't necessarily high enough tier to be really doing their own thing. They're either borrowing from other strategies or really just, solving the weakness and resistance of this format. Next up, we have Rain Dance, which last time was a very prominent deck. It was the next best deck behind Haymaker because of Gyarados and its ability, and Blastoise's ability to accelerate energy to said Gyarados, which of course has a resistance to Hitmonchan. But we're actually going to see it fall down a peg too, because again, it's playing a lot of low HP Pokemon, which means it's going to be easier for other decks to get the knockout. There's more decks that are running Electabuzz now, so Magikarp is a sitting duck, as well as your Squirtles, your Wartortles if you're playing them, so it's going to find itself at the top of Tier 2. It is kind of crazy to see Rain Dance already getting knocked down a peg, but don't worry, it won't be staying there long in future formats. Now, Damage Swap actually got a huge upgrade here, and real quickly I'll talk about the fact that the other Damage Swap that we had last time isn't on the list. So I decided to omit any of the decks that were in the non-competitive or trash tier, as they didn't get any upgrades this set, so it doesn't make sense to try to continuously include decks if they're just going to end up in the same exact tier with no modifications. The Damage Swap Mr. Mime, or Alakazam Mr. Mime, is actually a really powerful deck in this format. Mr. Mime is the biggest upgrade that this deck saw, so it's no longer playing the Gyarados. Instead, it's playing Mr. Mime and Scyther on top of the Chanseys, so it has a much better matchup against Haymaker, but again, it still suffers from the fact that it's playing low HP Pokemon, but it has definitely a better matchup against Haymaker than it did before, as Mr. Mime actually deals weakness damage to Hitmonchan instead of just being a Pokemon that resists it. Now you have Scyther to resist it, and that helps you hit other marks of damage, as it can do 30 damage consistently, as opposed to Mr. Mime, which requires your opponent to have damage already. So the Mr. Mime is so important because of its Invisible Wall, which is a Poke Power that makes it so any attack that would do 30 or more damage to it does no damage instead. So you have to hit 20 or less in order to do damage, which means you cannot one-hit KO this Pokemon unless you shut off its Invisible Wall, which means first you're going to have to attack it anyways to get paralysis or sleep on it. And that makes it really difficult for any aggressive deck to just brute force its way into Damage Swap. This makes it so that anytime, your opponent deals 20 damage to Mr. Mime, cool, you're just going to move that to Chansey. It makes it so that Damage Swap has a much bigger footing, as it's controlling the amount of damage it takes and then moving it, as opposed to just taking ridiculous amounts of damage and struggling to find a place to put it. So now, at most, as long as you have your Mr. Mime in the active, you're going to be moving 2 damage counters every turn, which is much more manageable. And I'm going to have to take back what I said. It actually is going to replace Rain Dance at the top of Tier 2. So Damage Swap and Rain Dance, I think they're kind of interchangeable because Rain Dance is a more aggressive strategy, but because the Damage Swap Mr. Mime has a better matchup against the Haymaker deck, it's just going to end up doing better. The biggest problem with the deck is, of course, you're playing the Abras, you're playing low HP Pokemon still, and there are a lot of decks in this format that can take advantage of it. Everyone's playing 3 or 4 copies of Gust of Wind, so they can still get knockouts and take out all of your important pieces pretty early on. And the deck also just doesn't play a lot of switching options, so it makes it difficult if your opponent is just going super crazy aggressive and using all of their Gust of Winds to take out your Abras or even your Chanseys. Next up, we have another stall deck here, Venucenter. Venucenter actually gets a couple new support cards. Dodrio is a card that really helps Venucenter, as it makes it so that Venusaur is never stuck in the active, which is usually what your opponent's going to try to do to stop what you're doing. It also gets Scyther, which is obviously a card that everyone's playing in this format, but Scyther is a really good free retreater, so if you don't want to run the Dodrio line, you now have an access to a really good free retreater that you can actually, power up with your grass energy. I mean, Scyther requires colorless, but with its Swords Dance, you can set up an early Scyther to deal tons of damage. It also makes it so that playing double colorless is a bit more justified, although I wouldn't play more than like 1 or 2 copies. And then lastly, it gets Exeggutor, which is a card we'll go into further detail about later. Venusaur, unfortunately, is going to find itself falling a peg down, as it's in the rogue tier now, because there are so many decks that are running counters to Scyther that you're going to be running into a lot of fire types if you're going to be playing in a large scale tournament, which obviously, you know, the format is not something where it's not a format where you're going to be going to a lot of large scale tournaments, but it's a format that I would like to see large scale tournaments for, and Venucenter is not a deck that would do very well at said tournaments because of how many fire types you're going to be running into. It makes it really hard to move the energy around and, you know, Poké Center properly. So you're going to be playing defense. I mean, you're always playing defense with Venucenter, but you're going to be playing defense in the sense that you're going to be trying to stall to get to your Poké Centers a lot more than you were before. Next, we have another fire-type deck. This is Buzzap Arcanine, which we saw getting some success. I believe I had it in the Rogue tier before, but now it is actually in the anti-meta tier as it's moved up a little bit from where it was before. And again, it's because there's so many Scythers running around. You now hit really good numbers for dealing with the meta. It's also important to note with decks that have shifted up or down, it's all because of the fact that, or mostly because of the fact that Haymaker gets knocked down a peg, meaning that everything else kind of gets knocked down a peg as well. But yeah, Buzzap Arcanine is still in a really good spot, being in the third tier from the top, just because of the fact that it hits really good weakness numbers. There's nothing really new that the deck gets. It's just now that the meta has warped, it's now in a better position. Now we can talk about the new Buzzap deck, Buzzap Eggs or Exeggutor. This is a really interesting deck because Exeggutor has an attack called Explosion, which does 20 damage on a coin flip for every energy attached to it. And since Electrode counts as 2 energy, you can attach Electrode, Double Colorless, Grass Energy, any energy. And it'll be doing tons and tons of damage really quickly. And it's on a stage 1 with a couple other really cool attacks in the deck, such as Hypnosis, which the Execute has, which puts your opponent to sleep, and then Teleport, which Exeggutor has, which is a switching attack, so as soon as you use it, you can just switch out. The biggest detriment to this deck is its high retreat cost, and there's not really a way to justify playing Dodrios, so I would still recommend playing switches in the deck. And if you ever want to see deck profiles for any of these, let me know, and I would love to do those. But yeah, so this deck just hits crazy numbers really quickly, and if your opponent isn't playing a high count of energy removal and super energy removal, they're going to have a really hard time keeping up with this deck. But unfortunately, again, it is a grass type, and it only has 80 HP, so it's going to find itself in the rogue tier, as it doesn't really answer anything in the meta directly. I'm going to put it above Venucenter even, just because Venucenter doesn't have a way to get powered up quickly, so you can get shut down just as fast with Venucenter as opposed to Exeggutor, which can set up really quickly. And if it can get the ball rolling first, then you're going to end up winning quite a few matches. But unfortunately, it's not good enough to the point where it deserves a higher spot, because really the only thing it interacts with the meta is Rain Dance, and since Rain Dance gets knocked down a peg, all of these grass decks are going to suffer the same fate. Now, next up we have Clefable, which is the evolution of Clefairy, which was a card we got in base set, but Clefairy was too low HP, and its Metronome attack required too much energy, but now Clefable's Metronome only requires 1 colorless energy. And you're also pairing it with the Dodrio again, so that way you can switch in and out. This deck usually plays Scyther, Hitmonchan, or Electabuzz, any combination of those 3. So it still has the Haymaker type vibe, just now Clefable is one of your main attackers. And Metronome, if you don't know, it allows you to copy any of the attacks of your opponent's defending Pokemon and use it as this attack. You still have to do all the requirements of the attack, such as discarding energy or anything else, but you only need the 1 energy to actually use the attack, which is really nice. The biggest problem with it is it still has pretty low HP. It's only 70 HP, and it has a weakness to fighting, and there's a lot of decks in this format that are playing Hitmonchan, so it does suffer a little bit, but because of the fact that it can pretty much use any attack, and it runs the Dodrio for resistance against Haymaker and the Scythers, it can pretty much tech in whatever it wants, because Clefable's the only real main attacker. I just have Dodrio in there because that's what it's most commonly paired with. but it's going to find itself in anti-meta. It's going to be just above Charizard, but behind Buzzap Arcanine for sure. Now, next up, we have one of the most infamous decks introduced in Jungle. This is Wigglybuzz. Wigglybuzz is predominantly focused around Wigglytuff and its Do the Wave attack, and its partner Pokemon Electabuzz, which we all know from Haymaker is an amazing card. But Do the Wave does 10 damage for each benched Pokemon, just plus 10 damage. So base of 10, and then 10 more for each of your benched Pokemon. It falls just short of knocking out any of the Haymakers, but that's why this deck runs 4 plus power, so it can get those easy knockouts on Hitmonchan, Electabuzz, Scyther. It also, pairs really well with Electabuzz, as Electabuzz has low energy requirements, so you can have Electabuzz in the front, try to get those paralysis off while you build up your Wigglytuffs in the background. Plus, Jigglypuff and Wigglytuff both have Sleep or Sing, I think. I don't remember exactly what the attack is. Lullaby, where it puts your opponent to sleep, which can be really good for trying to set up as well. So this deck is actually going to find itself at tier 1, which is pretty crazy. That we see the first deck that really is at the same level as Haymaker, because you can also play this deck with Hitmonchan as a partner. Obviously, Wigglybuzz is Wigglytuff Electabuzz, but this is more so Wigglytuff Haymaker, and you can certainly play it with Hitmonchan as well. Next, we have Rapidash Haymaker, which this is just, once again, another Haymaker variant, but this time it chooses to partner with Rapidash, which is a much easier setup than Charizard, but can deal one-hit KOs on Scyther and Exeggutor, which is really nice. So Rapidash is also a free retreater, so you don't have to worry about playing Scythers yourself and dealing with the other fire types in the format. Unfortunately, again, this is an evolution strategy and really only counters Scyther. It doesn't really do anything else other than countering Scyther and running the normal Haymaker stuff. So I'm actually going to put it in the anti-meta just because Ponyta has really low HP. I think it's only 40 HP and doesn't have that good of an attack. So I'm going to put it behind the Clefable Dodrio deck. And this is one of my favorite decks in this format that I actually only recently found out about. It's just Rage. I call it Rager, but it's basically just a deck that plays Dodrio and Tauros, as they both have the Rage attack, which for 3 colorless energy does 10 damage plus 10 more damage for every damage counter on it. And with Tauros, that means you can do 60 damage. With Dodrio, that means you can do 70 damage if you're all the way damaged but not knocked out. And it plays some really interesting cards that no other deck in the format can play. It plays Revives, which normally is a terrible card because sure, you can bring back a Pokemon from your discard pile, but then you put damage counters on it till its HP is equal to half its original HP, but that actually helps its attacks, as their attacks do 10 damage for every damage counter on it. So it makes it so that with Revive, even if your opponent's knocking out your Pokemon really quickly, as long as you can get them powered up again, it will be just as easy for you to get knockouts. I personally would kind of want to try testing this out with the Buzzap Electrode, but I haven't seen any lists include it, so I'm not going to consider that here, as I haven't done any testing with it. But Magnemite is your partner Pokemon, as for its 2 energy, it can do Self-Destruct for 40, and then it does 40 to itself, but 10 damage to each bench Pokemon, both yours and your opponent's, which is really good attack. So you're putting that chip damage on your opponents, and then you're also getting 10 damage on your Rage attackers, which is really good. And you play this deck with defenders as well, so that way you can try to mitigate the damage against your already weakened Pokemon. So if you put a defender on Magnemite, they won't even KO itself with Self-Destruct, and then you can hopefully survive the next turn and do another Self-Destruct to get a knockout and have your Rage Pokemon set up even further. And whereas this deck is really fun, again, it's playing Pokemon that are directly weak to Haymaker, Tauros, which is weak to fighting, and the Magnemite, which is weak to fighting, as well as the Dodrio, which is weak to lightning. So I'm going to put this just above the Boyfriends deck in non-competitive. I don't think that this deck will really have any chance of winning tournaments. But I think it's a really fun deck and a deck that is definitely worth doing some further testing with to try to optimize the build. Next, we have Pure Do the Wave, which, as you can see, his partner Pokemon here is a Clefairy, which is pretty funny, as Clefairy was a card that didn't really see any play in base set only, but Clefairy counts as a Pokemon while it's on the bench. So you can use Wigglytuff's attack and just have like a bunch of Clefairy set up. So it's basically intended to be a faster Wigglytuff build. The problem is that because you're losing your Electabuzz, you don't really have another good attacker, which means that you don't have anything to put on pressure while you're setting up your Wigglytuff. I personally think it's more of a fun deck to play just because it's really fun to quickly get out those Clefairy and get the Do the Wave attack off, but unfortunately, it does suffer from the fact that energy removal is still rampant in the format, so you're going to run into a lot of that when you're trying to set up your Wigglytuff. So I'm still going to put it in Tier 2, but it's not as good as its counterpart, the Wigglybuzz deck. Next up, we have our last of the Buzzap decks. This is Buzzapdos, the most infamous of the Buzzap decks, and last time it was in Tier 1, as it had a really good matchup against Haymaker, but also, could suffer from the fact that Voltorbs are an easy mark for Hitmonchan. And here we're going to find it at the bottom of Tier 2, as it's sort of the same deal once again, but now there's just more Hitmonchans running around. So it is still a good deck for sure, and still has some really good matchups, like has a great matchup against Blastoise, but it also suffers from the fact that Mr. Mime is running around everywhere, and having your Zapdos set up doesn't really do anything against Mr. Mime, because now you can't hit Mr. Mime, or you're just kind of stuck, and I feel like that's one of the biggest reasons why it suffers so harshly here, is at least with Buzzap Arcanine, you can use Growlithe to hit that perfect 20 damage, but you can't do that here with the Buzzapdos. You'll have to start attacking with your Voltorbs and your Electrodes if you run into that situation. Next up, we have the new premier threat of the jungle set, which is Lickitung Stall. And Lickitung is paired with Mr. Mime here, as well as Chansey and Scyther. And as we've said before, Mr. Mime is crazy for stalling, but Lickitung is just as good as a mill option. Not directly, of course, but for its Tongue Wrap, it does 10 damage for 1 energy, and then on a coin flip paralyzes, which paralysis basically just means your opponent draws a card and then can't do anything that turn unless they play switches. And because there's a lot of decks that are running Dodrio, there's less decks that are running Switch now, which means they're just going to be stuck, they're just going to have to pass, and you can potentially just keep going with your coin flips, and you're going to be playing Switch, so that way you can switch into your Mr. Mime when your opponent finally sets up their big attacker, and then they can just sit there and look stupid. But this deck is actually going to be the best bet you have if you don't want to play Haymaker. This is the second best deck in the format, as it deals really well with Haymaker, surprisingly, and it also has really good matchups against a lot of other decks in the format. So Lickitung Stall is definitely a deck to consider if you're going to end up playing this format. Next, we have the last stall option in this tier list, which is Pure Stall, the Chansey build. This could be, once again, either the build that plays energy or the build that doesn't. Either way, the goal is still pretty much the same, to just stall out your opponent and get them to deck out. This deck has a lot less good matchups now, unfortunately, and because there's more attackers in the format, there's also more Hitmonchans. It's going to find itself at the top of Rogue tier, because I think it's still a better stall option than Venucenter. And I think generally you'll probably pick up more games than with Exeggutor, so it's still going to be a deck to consider, but I wouldn't really place any bets on it for sure. And we also have here the last deck, including Mr. Mime, getting towards the end of the decks here. This deck is hilarious. I've seen this from Shuckle TCG. I had never heard of it before, but it's a deck that I've always wanted to sort of work. Raticate is a really fun card with Super Fang, which just cuts your opponent's HP in half, and then paired with Mr. Mime to actually have the Meditate attack for 2 energy, does 10 damage plus 10 more damage for every damage counter on your opponent's Pokemon. You can two-shot anything in the format, which is crazy. Raticate has a low retreat cost as well, so you can just pretty easily switch in and out of these. And yeah, this is a really fun deck. Shuckle TCG called it Medicate. I'm just going to call it MimeRat. Yeah, this is a really fun deck, and by nature, it's going to find itself in anti-meta. I'm going to put it at the bottom of anti-meta just because Raticate is such an easy mark for Hitmonchans. He also played it with Jinx, although I'm not sure that's the best partner Pokemon for the deck because you really don't want to have too many high energy cost Pokemon. I'd probably test this with Scyther, as once again, everyone's playing Scyther. And sure, you now have to worry about fire Pokemon, but Scyther also helps out with the fact that you're weak to Hitmonchan, so you can sort of have your Scyther out in the front, sponging damage while you set up your Raticate and your Mr. Mime. And last but not least, we have Haymaker with Charmander and Dodrio. There's not really a good name for this deck, but this was on the J-Class forum, and it's a really interesting because it plays just 4 Charmander, plus the Hitmonchans, and a Dodrio line. It only plays 1 Charmeleon, and personally, I'm not even sure that I would consider playing the Charmeleon outside of, maybe a good option for dealing with Lickitung, so that way if you get paralyzed, you can just put Charmeleon on there and get right back to attacking. The deck deals really well against any of the decks that are playing Scyther, because Charmander alone with a plus power can get a one-hit KO on Scythers, and then the Dodrio makes it so you can easily switch in and out of your Charmander and your Hitmonchan depending on what you're up against. So this deck is really cool, and I don't think it competes directly with Haymaker as well as it probably wants to, but it is going to find itself smack dab in the middle of tier 2. And with that, that is the tier list for base and jungle format. This format is a lot more chaotic and less solved than I think base set is. I think everyone knows what's going on with base set, what works and what doesn't, but in jungle format, there's so many moving parts now that I feel like depending on the day, the best deck could be something different, and that's really what you want in a format. That's how standard usually plays out, as if you look at every regional, typically each regional is going to have a different winning list, which is really what a trading card game is all about. You don't want a format that's solved and has a definitive best deck, because that makes it go stale. It makes the format boring, which is why I think a lot of people don't return to base set format, but everyone loves base through fossil. And this is just the step before that, so I think more people should try out the base and jungle format, because it feels like the perfect mix of the two worlds. There's nothing too crazy going on. The power level hasn't increased that much since base set, but now there's just more options available, and there's more decks that can thrive. So I hope you guys enjoyed watching this tier list. I sure as hell enjoyed making it, and I'd love to see what you guys think about it in the comments. Let me know if there's anything you would have done differently, if there's decks that you think I should have included, or maybe decks that you think shouldn't have even been on the list, or maybe they should be at the very least on a lower tier or a higher tier. Let me know what you think. Leave a like if you enjoyed. Consider subscribing. Have a good day.